Emotions are energy in motion. They are the energy that moves us, our human fuel. Our emotions are also like the red light oil gauge on our car signaling us about a need, a loss, or a satiation. Our anger is our strength. Our fear is our discernment. Our sadness is our healing feeling. Our guilt is our conscience former. Our shame signals our essential limitation and is the source of our spirituality. When our emotions are shamed, they are repressed. Repression involves tensing muscles and shallow breathing. One set of muscles is mobilized to block the energy of the emotion we're ashamed to feel. Sadness is commonly converted into a false smile, reactive formation. I have often smiled when I felt sad. Once the energy is blocked, we no longer feel it. However, it is still a form of energy. It is dynamic. I already gave you the example of how repressed anger intensifies. Our anger explodes because it cannot be repressed anymore. In reenactment, the emotional energy is acted out or acted in. The behavior that set up the shaming event is repeated with surrogates who reenact the original shaming scene, or a person shames himself in the way he was originally shamed. This can occur through destructive self-talk, or it can happen when a person cuts himself or drives himself mercilessly, refusing to take breaks, get proper rest, or take legitimate vacations. Cutters form a significant part of our population, an estimated 3 million as of 2005. They inflict wounds on themselves in various ways with various objects. They try to punish themselves for their carried toxic shame and guilt, immortality shame. Reenacting victimization. Incest victims often continue to reenact their earlier sexual violation in one relationship after another. In being violated, such a person is used and then abandoned. The abuse is often translated into the message that sex is the only way they are desirable or worthwhile. I have to be sexy and sexual, or else I'm nothing. Leander was 30 years old. She had already established herself as a businesswoman. She had her own ad agency. Her husband wanted her to quit her job to have children. He was verbally shaming her and threatening to destroy her business. She hated her husband, who demanded oral sex 4 times a week. Leander was having an affair. When I talked to her husband, I determined quickly that he was an offender. He talked about her like she was an object. He told me he didn't care what she did as long as she took care of his sexual needs 4 times a week and gave him a baby. Leander's affair was with a well-known womanizer. Over the course of the therapy, she had the baby, gave up her career, and had several more affairs. She finally divorced her husband and continued to have one affair after another. Each time she chose a high-rolling, wealthy male with a history of womanizing, a level 1 sex addict. Each time she was showered with gifts, used sexually, and abandoned. And each time she was reenacting the sexual abuse she had experienced from her alcoholic father. From age 5 until 10, she had frequently performed fellatio on her father. She was his favorite. He showered her with gifts. He gave her the only love she got in her childhood. Leander was extremely seductive. She wore clothes that made a man immediately look at her sexually. She came to see that her seduction was a way to act out her shame. It was a way to gain control over the situation she had previously been powerless in. It was a way to work out her unresolved grief. In every single case when the man left her, she could have the feeling she was forbidden to have in the original situation. She would cry, she would be angry, and rage. Each reenactment was an abortive attempt to act out the feelings she had dissociated from. In her normal dissociated state, she was out of touch with these feelings. She often felt like she was crazy. In acting out the feelings, she felt less crazy. This repetition compulsion, this urge to repeat, is referred to by Alice Miller as the logic of absurdity. It happens in less cruel ways to many people. I know a man who grew up with an emotionally unavailable mother. He was married 4 times, all to emotionally unavailable women. The best-selling book, Women Who Love Too Much by Robin Norwood, describes variation after variation of this reenactment. Criminal behavior. In Alice Miller's work on criminality, she presents the case of Jürgen Bartsch, who was a child murderer. He murdered 4 boys between 1962 and 1966. With some minor deviations, his modus operandi was the same. After he enticed a boy into a former air raid shelter not far from his home, he beat the child into submission, tied him up with butcher's string, manipulated his genitals while he masturbated, killed the child by strangulation or by blows, cut open the body, emptied out the stomach, and buried the remains. Bartsch testified that he would achieve sexual climax while he was cutting up the corpses. The details of this account are truly nauseating. One feels outrage and horror. Surely such a person has criminal genes or some pathological sexual drive and perversion. However, as Alice Miller outlines the details of Jurgen's childhood, one cannot easily dismiss her thesis that there is a direct relationship between Jurgen's criminality and his early childhood. She writes, "Every crime contains a concealed story that can be deciphered from the way the misdeed is enacted and from its specific details." The specific details are beyond the scope of my purpose here. Bartsch was an orphan who was adopted after his parents made a careful search to find the right child. Jurgen would spend hours ritually looking for the right boy to murder. Jurgen was beaten as a baby. On many occasions, he was found black and blue and bruised. He was beaten by his mother in the same room that his father, who was a butcher, was cutting up carcasses. Later, as the beatings continued, he was locked in an old underground cellar. This went on for 6 years. He was forbidden to play with any other children. He was sexually abused by his mother. She bathed him until he was 12 years old, manipulating his genitals. At the age of 8, he was seduced by his 13-year-old cousin, and later, at 13, by his teacher. His crimes bore the imprint of each detail of his life. He acted out his pent-up hatred on the little boys who all wore lederhosen, just as Jurgen had done as a child. He cut them up with a butcher knife, as he had seen his father do while Jurgen was being whipped, beaten, and abused by his mother. She would often give him wet kisses on the mouth after she had beaten him. Jurgen also kissed his victims. Jurgen was a victim who became an offender. He awakens our outrage and horror. But, as Alice Miller writes, the horror should be directed at the first murder, the abuse which was committed in secret and went unpunished. When a child is being violated, his normal reaction is to cry out in anger and pain. The anger is forbidden because it would bring more punishment. The expression of pain is also forbidden. The child represses these feelings, identifies with the aggressor, and represses the memory of the trauma. Later, disconnected from the original cause and the original feelings of anger, helplessness, confusion, and pain, he acts out these powerful feelings against others in criminal behavior or against himself in drug addiction, prostitution, psychic disorders, and suicide. Again, Alice Miller writes, "Someone who was not allowed to be aware of what was being done has no way of telling about it except to repeat it." In a lesser way, many parents who have not worked through their own childhood trauma will reenact it on their own children. A slogan we use for our Center for Recovery Families is, "You either pass it back or you pass it on." From this section, you can see the extent and life-damaging power of internalized shame. Its power lies in its darkness and secrecy. By exposing this demon, we can begin to set up educational programs and therapeutic approaches to prevent shame from being internalized in families.